In today's video, I'm sharing the biggest mistakes a beginner photographer can make. At the end of the video, I'll tell you one tip I wish I knew as a beginner. I'm Ryan, and on this channel, I cover photography and cinematography, tutorials, tips, and tricks. So the first part of this video is the mistakes you make when shooting. The first mistake is missing focus. This is a big one because often beginners either don't know how to focus or don't know how good or bad the autofocus is on their lens and camera combination. And while there are some apps that are coming around that fix it in post, it's quite difficult, takes a while, and not always perfect. So I'm not going to recommend you do that. I recommend you get it right in the first place. If you miss focus, not only will your viewer not be able to see the story, they won't know what to look at in the image because the composition might be pointing to one thing and the focus should be pointing to that thing, but the focus will be pointing to something else. Okay, the second mistake is motion blur. Motion blur is the worst looking artifact in any photo. It looks the worst because, as I discussed in my How to Get Sharper Photos video, motion blur makes the photo look a lot softer than just raising the ISO, getting more noise, then lowering the shutter speed so you can get less motion blur. Now, of course, motion blur is possible to remove in post if it's minor, but it's not perfect, and as I said, if it's major, it won't look so good. Motion blur can be used creatively, however. For example, sport photographers often hold their camera and swing it with the motion of the person they're taking a photo of and raise the shutter speed a little bit. So that way the person is sharp, but the background has motion blur, giving the illusion of movement. Now the next mistake is exposure. If you shoot in RAW, you can fix it to a point of maybe 1 or 2 stops over or under, but any more than that and it just becomes noisy or completely blown out. And when you overexpose and then bring down the exposure, skin tones often end up looking either too golden or too silver. This is a very easy thing to fix. You just either turn up or down the shutter speed, ISO, or aperture. I have an upcoming video on how to shoot in manual, so make sure you're subscribed for that if you don't know what aperture, ISO, and shutter speed are. The next mistake is confusing composition. This is a big one that I still make a lot because if you have confusing composition, you can't get your message across to the viewer because there are things that detract from the story or don't add to it in any way. And if you can't get your message across to the viewer, then it's not going to be a good photo because no one will know what it means. This last one when shooting is a big one. File backup fail. Now if you fail at this and you accidentally erase the card or delete a photo off of your card and you haven't backed up the photos properly, then you lose the photo. That's pretty self-explanatory. I have an upcoming video for proper file management for photographers and cinematographers with a free YouTube photography and cinematography file structure download. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that video. What's one tip that you would give to a beginner photographer? Let me know in the comments down below. So the second part of this video is mistakes photographers make in the editing process. So the first mistake, which I am certainly guilty of, is over editing. This makes the photo look too digital and people won't be able to see the story you're telling. They will just see the fact that the saturation is way too high or the texture is way too high, and that will distract them from the main focus of the image. So the second mistake is not cropping. Now this is a really easy one to fix because you can even do it on your phone with the built-in camera app. It detracts from the composition because you'll have extra things around the edges of the frame that do not add to the story that could be cut out, and it would leave the photo not aligned with the horizon on an angle, and that would annoy the viewer. The next mistake for editing is selective coloring. Selective coloring is when everything in an image becomes grayscale except for one object. For example, the background becomes grayscale and I am still in color, or I'm grayscale and the background's in color. It looks very boring and is quite cliche at this point. The next mistake is overusing black and white when it's not necessary. Black and white can be used when you shot a photo underexposed and you want to hide the noise, but it looks boring, and unless you're using it for a specific creative effect, then there's no point having it on the photo. Here's one tip that I wish I knew when I was a beginner for those of you who stuck around for the entire video. The tip is to learn the camera you have, whether it be your phone, an entry-level camera, or an expensive camera, inside and out, because you can produce much better images with this cheap camera and cheap lens that you know well than if you had a much more expensive camera, because you know what ISO you can shoot up to, how good the autofocus is, whether you need to use manual focus or not, how to expose properly, whether you need to expose 1 stop over, 1 stop under, or just right. You know how good the white balance is, whether you'll need to change it in post or not, and you can change settings much quicker because of the muscle memory you'll gain over time. Click here to learn how to take better photos with a kit lens included with your camera. But first, click here to subscribe.